Hey everyone, welcome. This is the Tinnitus Virtual Summit. My name is Dr. Ben, your host. Today we are here with Dr. Brian Taylor, who is an audiologist, and Brian is coming to us from Minnesota. So Brian is the director and clinical content development at Signia, and he's here with us. Brian is a veteran of the hearing industry with more than 25 years experience. So we wanted to bring on Brian for the Tinnitus Summit and ask him, how have you seen COVID-19 affect the tinnitus and hearing communities in these past months, Brian?
Well, I think that the big change in the industry, as everyone out there in the clinic probably has experienced themselves, is just the incredible ramp up to the use of telecare, telehealth, remote services, whatever you want to call it. I think that a lot of that technology has kind of been languishing on the sidelines for a number of years. I know the VA has been dabbling with it, a few other practices, but now in a big way, it's starting to become utilized. In fact, I know at Signia, we did an internal survey, and something like a third of the 800 or so respondents had started using telehealth just in the last 90 days. And of those that started to use it, the vast majority really liked it. And they said that they would continue to use it even after social distancing guidelines were lifted, that they still wanted to see their provider, but they thought that telehealth had a place. So that's the big change. I think a lot of people were, I like to say they were telehealth curious. And now that they've kind of dipped their toe in, they seem to really like it.
Hmm. Thank you, Ryan. And for those who don't know, Signia is a hearing aid company with research with providing hearing aids to clinical audiologists and other forms of delivery.
Mm-hmm.
And Brian, can you share how Signia specifically is taking this information about the changing landscape from the classical delivery model of hearing aids? And there was already some trends of going online or internet based, but now that folks are not so willing to go in person to see a doctor, how is your group re-strategizing or making sure everyone has resources to serve the needs of the patients?
Right. Well, I think you have to look at Signia and Widex as part of the larger WS Audiology. And I'm probably not the person to talk to about strategic imperatives of WS Audiology, but I can tell you from my role within the company, and that's tempered with my almost 30 years of experience, that I think the what Signia is doing is more of an evolution of what they've been, as a company, they've been doing for 30 years. As a lot of people probably know, Signia just a few short years ago was Siemens, and Siemens was the first hearing aid to have learning capability. And now we're seeing a lot of these remote adjustments, remote fine tuning guided by artificial intelligence principles. That's become a popular kind of a buzzword, but it's really, in the Signia world, I think that just kind of represents an evolution of what's been going on for a number of years. It's just now getting to be more robust. Users now have more capability to make their own adjustments remotely with their smartphone, or to connect with their provider who makes the adjustments. So the provider is still very much a part of that process. Some other things that Signia and WS Audiology, I think, brings to the table is the shoebox audiometry, which is portable web-based testing. So that can become part of the process. And I think, it's really up to the provider how they want to use those tools. But it gives, and especially in this day and age when people can't get around, it gives the consumer a choice on how they want to interact with their provider. So I think that's a positive for everybody in the industry. We're all looking for ways to connect with more people with hearing loss. I think with that legacy that Signia has, you can continue to see, the progress around these tools and how they become more consumer friendly and easier to use.
Yeah, certainly. And before this call, I was reviewing the Market Track 10 study, which is the largest data gathering of uh, folks who have hearing loss or have hearing aids. and what are their preferences? What kind of devices do they prefer? And when are they seeing specialists? When are they seeking care? All these important questions.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any reflections on the data market track 10, as well as the last 6 months during COVID-19? There's a lot of data from market track 10, and now there's a lot of new developments and shifting. So what can, for the viewer who's watching this who may have tinnitus and likely some degree of hearing loss, what are some important tips or important considerations they should know as the individual who has hearing loss?
Well, I mean, you bring up market track 10. I think, that represents, that's like the over a 30-year period of time, maybe longer than that, since the early 90s, I guess they've been doing those surveys. And, one thing it shows is that over time, people have become more and more satisfied with devices, and the level of satisfaction they have with their provider has always been pretty high, and it maybe ticked up a little bit over the last few surveys. So I think what that represents, and what COVID, I think, some of the changes in what's going on in our society, it just shows you the importance of having a trusted professional that you can interact with. Somebody that uses scientific principles to make decisions, somebody who is emotionally engaged in the process with the patient. I think even what I like to say is that, as technology becomes more and more automated and easier for people to use, the humanistic element of what the provider offers is more important than ever before. And I think that applies to people that have hearing loss, that have tinnitus. We have a lot of tools available to us now, and you really need an expert that you trust, that you can work with, that kind of gets where you're coming from, and it feels like they're in your shoes, that can help you sort out the options and kind of get the most out of the technology. And that's never going to go out of style, I don't think. And it's the great thing about the virtual world is now you can do some of those things without leaving your home. And get the same level of care. You can kind of pick and choose when you want to go into the office. A lot of our patients are older, and they have to find a way to get a ride to the office, or they got to take time away from work, or somebody else has to take time away from work. So now with some of these remote tools, you can supplement the in-person care with the remote care, but it still boils down to having a trusting relationship with a professional.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I agree.
Mm-hmm.
And how about from the professional perspective for an audiologist? What are the big takeaways from Market Track 10, as well as recent developments during COVID, where we're on the same team? We want to make sure audiologists are up to date and not surprised by any developments or changes. So what are some important tips or takeaways that an audiologist or hearing care provider should be aware of in these next few years?
Well, in reference to Market Track 10?
Yeah, in reference to Market Track 10, and also in reference to COVID-19 and how that's changing the industry.
Well, I think in reference to COVID-19, I think you have to be open-minded about remote technology, remote tuning of the hearing aid, remote visits, remote testing. I think you have to be open-minded about how you bring that into your practice. I think we're past the era where you can ignore those things, or you can, put up a fuss and say, I'm not going to do that, because it's really driven by consumers more than it is by the profession as far as what tools are out there. Market Track 10, and there's so much information in that. I mean, there was an entire issue of Seminars in Hearing published earlier this year, and there's like 6 articles that are all related to the Market Track 10 findings. The one article that really, I think, if I had to pick one out of that group, and they're all really good articles, but the one that I would have audiologists read and really try to put some of the concepts into practice is the one on market segmentation that Brent Edwards, formerly of Starkey, who's now at NAL in Australia, I think he really lays out a case for the limitations of segmenting your market around degrees of hearing loss, and that you have to kind of divide the market up into people that have measured hearing loss and people that have perceived hearing difficulty, and hearing aid owners and non-owners. And each one of those segments of the market needs something different. Um, it builds a case for OTC. It builds a case for um, having non-device kinds of approaches to working with people. So anyway, I think there's a lot of good stuff there to take away in that Market Track 10.
Yeah, that's good. Thanks for the recommendation to check out Brent Edwards' piece on market segmentation. Now, you are also very involved with Hearing Health Matters, correct? Would you like to explain your role with that group and what you provide and what someone who isn't aware of Hearing Health
Sure.
Matters should know about you guys?
Well, Hearing Health and Technology Matters, or as we like to say, HHTM, is a blog that's been around for more than a decade now. I've been involved with them 5 or 6 years in different capacities. It's mainly a site that has it's really for professionals and for consumers. We have about 30,000, I think, unique individual readers of the blog every month. We have about 10 or 15 writers. It's a great place for industry news. We have a couple of writers who are non-professionals that look at things from the consumer point of view. In addition to into just general industry news, we like to, I think our focus is we like to take what we think are relevant or pertinent studies in the peer-reviewed literature, and then summarize them into, here are the actionable points for providers. I know over the years we've done some review articles on tinnitus studies. Anyway, we like to, we just like to have we like to think we have our pulse on the industry and on the profession and what both professionals and what consumers want.
Are there any specific articles that come to mind from the last year or two that are very memorable?
Well, I think, the person that is the owner or the editor-in-chief is an audiologist by the name of Kevin Leiby, who's out in Washington State. He did a really nice, he reached out to maybe a dozen different people within the profession and had them write a thought piece on COVID-19 and how it might change the profession. So I'd take a look at that. It was published a couple of weeks ago. We try to do Amin Amlani, who was a professor down in Texas and Arkansas, and I think he's with Audiology now. He did a really nice piece a week or two ago on design thinking, and he's done some things on pricing that are really valuable, both from the consumer and the professional's point of view. In reference to tinnitus, I know we've done some things on just different studies that have come out and tried to take the main findings from those studies and summarize it so that they're more digestible for busy clinicians.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And another question here, what's something new that you've learned about hearing aids or tinnitus in the past year?
Well, I think in regards to hearing aids, I think that one of the things I learned, one of the more interesting things was that, we've all grown up with the prescriptive fitting approach where you enter audiograms into the fitting software and then you try to match a target and verify it with probe mic measures. And that, that's the gold standard. But there's technology that's now coming out that allows a person to self-fit without having their hearing tested. And there are a couple of studies out there that show with the right kind of interface, a person can arrive at very similar gain settings in their device without having a test done or without seeing a licensed professional. So that's pretty eye-opening, just because, again, I think the prescriptive fitting approach is probably going to remain the gold standard. But it's nice that consumers have another option for those that are capable of doing that on their own. They can do that. I think that opens the market for more people to use hearing aids. Of course, we hope that if those people can't do it or they mess it up, that they find an audiologist who can help them. I think that's a risk. I also know that there's a study out there done by Mike Valente's group that shows that if a person does, this is one that's sort of a win for the audiologists out there. that are doing best practices. But if you can get the response matched and verified with probe mic, that extra 5 or 10 dB in the high frequencies results in more than a 20% improvement in word recognition scores. So it matters to do things right. I think from the consumer standpoint, the thing I've learned is that there are some consumers maybe want to spend a little less money, or they want something that's more convenient, and they might be okay with an outcome that's just good enough. But then there's other consumers that are willing to spend the time and the money, and they expect the audiologist to do more than just a first fit because they want optimal outcomes. So it's really up to the audiologist then to make sure that they're practicing or using best practices. And you mentioned tinnitus. The thing that I've learned about tinnitus over the last couple of years is that it's good for the clinician, I think, to have a pretty wide or a big toolbox, that different devices, different maskers that or apps that have noise that a person can use for relaxation, to have availability of somebody who's proficient in cognitive behavioral therapy or counseling, that you need to have a couple of those things in your toolbox to help somebody. That you don't need anything, you don't necessarily need a lot of elaborate training. You can probably reach 90% of the people out there that have bothersome tinnitus with some relatively straightforward tools. So, I think of the work that Jim Henry at Portland VA has done around progressive tinnitus management. I think about what Jennifer Gans has done. These are things that can be, I think, kind of implemented into your own practice. What Richard Tyler has done at Iowa. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. There are things out there that you can apply to your own practice.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. And thank you for bringing that back to the individuals who have tinnitus and how that could influence their journey through a hearing test, potentially getting hearing aids with an audiologist or a hearing care provider, having good resources for these tinnitus patients, as well as knowing when and how to refer them out. That is very important. And everyone, we're here for the Tinnitus Virtual Summit. We're here with Dr. Brian Taylor, who is the Director of Clinical Content Development at Signia. Brian, we're very grateful that you've taken this time to join us and share some of your wisdom, being a veteran of the hearing industry. So I'm gonna give you the last few words here. So please say anything you wish, and then we'll sign off. And everyone else, make sure you watch the other videos for the Tinnitus Virtual Summit. There's over 10 interviews with some diverse professionals, and I highly encourage you check them out. Brian, thanks so much, and the floor is yours to say your final words.
Yeah, no, thanks, Dr. Ben. It's a pleasure to be here. I'll just kind of end things by saying that I think it's important that audiologists remain open-minded about OTC, or both OTC hearing aids, OTC tinnitus devices, around virtual testing. I think you have to always look at it from the perspective of the patient or the consumer and what they want, and what's right for them may not be right for the profession, but we have to figure out a way to make it work and still generate revenue so that we stay sustainable. And then also, don't ever diminish your own professional responsibility. I mean, there are a lot of people out there that need help for their hearing and for tinnitus. And, by any means necessary, really, as long as it's ethical, as long as there's some evidence to support what you're doing, it makes sense to try to grow the market and into, it's okay to, try different things that might be outside of the proverbial audiology box. Embrace the change. Think of it as an opportunity to help more people.